June 1946. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The smell hit them first. Wood smoke, thick and sweet, drifting over barbed wire like a question they couldn't answer. 48 German women climbed down from the transport truck. Nurses and radio operators who'd been taught that Americans were monsters, that capture meant torture, that mercy was just another word for trap. But there were no whips, no screaming guards, just paperwork, clean bunks, and that smell, not burning cities, but something cooking low and slow, like someone actually cared how it tasted. They'd survived firebombing and starvation. They'd lost everything. And now their enemy was feeding them? On the 4th of July, Sergeant Caldwell unveiled tables piled with brisket, ribs, and cornbread. Not rations, but a feast. And one German nurse broke down crying because she finally understood. The propaganda lied about everything. But if you want to hear how a plate of smoked meat shattered years of lies and rebuilt a shattered soul, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these untold stories reach. The smell hit Greta before she saw the camp. Wood smoke, sweet and heavy. Nothing like the acrid bite of burning cities. Through the truck's canvas flap, she caught it drifting across the Kansas prairie, and her stomach clenched hard enough to hurt. What kind of cruelty started with that smell? What kind of trap was baited with something that made you remember Sunday dinners from a lifetime ago? June 1946. The war had been over for 13 months, but Greta Kellerman still counted time in survival intervals. 13 months since the surrender. 6 months since the letter about her mother. 43 days since the train from the East Coast Processing Center. And now this, Camp Concordia, a grid of wooden barracks behind barbed wire, sitting in the middle of flat Kansas farmland that stretched so far it made her dizzy. The truck lurched to a stop. 47 other women shifted on the benches, their faces pale in the dim light filtering through canvas. Former nurses, radio operators, clerks, Wehrmacht auxiliaries, rounded up from field hospitals and communication bunkers across the Western Front. They'd spent weeks in transit, sleeping in holding facilities and displacement camps, each stop another layer of uncertainty. Greta had learned to read fear in a glance during her years patching soldiers back together. She saw it now in every face around her. The canvas flap yanked open. Sunlight flooded in, harsh and unforgiving. An American soldier stood there, young and sunburned, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He didn't point it at them. He didn't shout. He just gestured toward the opening and said something in English that sounded almost apologetic. They climbed down one by one, their legs stiff from the long ride. Greta's feet hit hard-packed dirt, and she steadied herself against the truck's side, taking in her surroundings with a nurse's practiced assessment. Barbed wire, yes. Guard towers at each corner. But no dogs straining at leashes. No soldiers with whips. No mud or filth. Everything was orderly, too orderly. Like a stage set designed to lull them into complacency before the real show began. Liesl Hoffman stumbled slightly as she jumped down, and Greta caught her elbow without thinking. The younger woman flashed her a grateful smile that Greta didn't return. 19 years old, and still capable of smiling, still believing things might be fine. Greta had been a nurse long enough to know that hope was just another word for not yet understanding. They were herded, gently, which was somehow worse, toward a low building marked with a Red Cross symbol. Inside, American women in clean uniforms checked them over with brisk efficiency. Not rough, not cruel, just thorough. Temperature taken, eyes and throat examined. Questions about chronic conditions and allergies asked through a translator. Greta answered in clipped German, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. This was how it worked, she knew. First they cataloged you, then they broke you down. But the breaking didn't come. Instead came paperwork. Identification cards with photographs. Assignment to Barracks Number 7. A cloth bag containing 2 gray dresses, underwear, a comb, soap that smelled like lavender instead of the harsh lye they'd used in the field hospitals. Greta held that soap in her palm, feeling its weight, suspicious of its gentleness. The barracks were clean. That was the first shock. Wooden floors swept bare, windows with real glass, bunks with mattresses that didn't reek of mildew or old fear. Greta was assigned a lower bunk near a window, and she sat on its edge, testing the mattress with her palm. It gave slightly under her weight. Actual stuffing, not just straw. Liesel claimed the bunk above hers, bouncing slightly to test it. "Maybe the stories weren't true," she whispered in German, her voice tentative with hope. "Maybe the Americans really do follow the Geneva rules." Greta said nothing. She'd heard the stories too. Every German soldier and auxiliary had. Whispered accounts of American brutality, torture disguised as interrogation, camps where prisoners disappeared into mass graves. The propaganda films had been explicit. Trust the enemy, and you died screaming. She'd believed it all through Dresden's firestorm, through the chaotic retreat west, through the surrender that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. But here was a clean bed, hot water in the washing room, soap that smelled like flowers. For 6 hours that afternoon, as they were processed and settled and left to rest before evening roll call, Greta let herself believe the worst might be over. Let herself imagine that maybe survival was possible. Maybe endurance would be enough. Then came mail call. The American Guard, a woman with gray hair and tired eyes, came through. Barracks, 7 just before sunset, carrying a canvas bag of letters forwarded through Red Cross channels. She called names in careful, accented German, handing out envelopes to women who snatched them with desperate hands. Most hadn't heard from home in months. Greta Kellerman, the woman called. The envelope was thin. Red Cross stamp, Hamburg postmark from January. Greta's hands shook as she opened it, sitting on her bunk while around her other women wept or laughed over their own news. The letter was from a neighbor, her mother's landlady. The words were spare and factual. Frau Anna Kellerman had died on January 18th, malnutrition and pneumonia. She'd been buried in the city cemetery, plot 447. The landlady was sorry for Greta's loss. There was nothing else. January 18th. Greta had been in an American field hospital then, recovering from exposure after 3 days trapped in a bombed-out aid station. They'd given her hot soup and warm blankets. They'd saved her life while her mother died of starvation an ocean away. The guilt rewired everything in an instant. Every kindness here became a mockery. Every clean sheet an insult. She didn't deserve mercy. Didn't deserve to survive. Her mother had kept her safe through childhood, through war, through the firebombing that turned Hamburg into hell. And Greta had been healing Americans, the enemy who dropped those bombs, when her mother needed her most. That night, Greta lay awake watching moonlight track across clean floorboards. Around her, women breathed in sleep, some crying softly in their dreams. That smoke smell drifted through the window again, carried on a prairie wind that smelled nothing like home. Somewhere beyond the barracks, American soldiers laughed. Music played on a distant radio. Greta gripped her mother's letter until the paper softened with sweat. If they're kind, she thought, staring at shadows on the ceiling, then what does that make us? What does that make me? The question had no answer. Only that smell of wood smoke, patient and persistent, like something waiting just beyond understanding. Morning came with a bell that sounded nothing like an alarm. No shouting, no barked orders, just a clear tone that rang across the compound at 6:30. Greta rose stiffly, her mother's letter still clutched in her hand from where she'd fallen asleep holding it. Around her, the other women stirred slowly, disoriented by the gentle wake-up. In the field hospitals, reveille had meant chaos, wounded men crying out, shells landing close enough to rattle instruments on their trays. This quiet felt obscene. They dressed in the gray camp-issue dresses and formed up outside for roll call. Captain Walter Morrison stood on a small platform, his uniform crisp despite the early hour, a clipboard in his hands. He counted them off in accented but clear German, then launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. The translator, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, rendered his words carefully. "Welcome to Camp Concordia. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with dignity. You will receive the same rations as American soldiers. You will be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip for any labor you perform. You have the right to send and receive mail, to attend religious services, to receive medical care." Greta waited for the but. It never came. Morrison simply folded his speech, tucked it into his clipboard, and dismissed them to breakfast. That was it. No threats. No speeches about punishment or re-education. Just rules, delivered like promises someone actually intended to keep. The mess hall smelled like coffee and something frying. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd choked down for years. Greta filed through the line behind Liesel, watching American soldiers serve food onto metal trays. Eggs. Actual eggs. Scrambled and still steaming. Toast with butter. A strip of bacon. Coffee poured from a huge urn. The portions were generous. Nobody was being shorted. Greta took her tray to a table and sat, staring at the food like it might bite her. Across from her, Liesel had already started eating, her eyes wide with something that looked dangerously close to joy. Other women ate cautiously, testing each bite for poison or trick. The eggs tasted like eggs. The toast was warm. The coffee was strong enough to cut through the fog in her skull. She managed 3 bites before her throat closed up. Every swallow felt like theft. Her mother had died eating watery soup made from potato peels. Greta was sitting in enemy territory, eating eggs and butter. The math didn't work. The universe didn't balance. A shadow fell across her tray. She looked up to find an American soldier standing there, older than most of the guards, with dark skin and eyes that had seen too much. His name tape read Caldwell. He didn't smile, but he didn't glare either. He just looked at her plate, then at her face, reading something there that made him nod slightly. "First day's always weird," he said in slow, careful English. The translator hovered nearby, but he waved her off, pantomiming eating, and then gesturing to Greta's barely touched food. He tried again, simpler. "Food's weird, but it's real. It's yours." His drawl wrapped around the words in a way that made them sound almost gentle. Greta stared at him, trying to find the trap, the angle, the hidden cruelty. But he just waited, patient as stone, until she picked up her fork and forced down another bite. He nodded again, satisfied, and moved on to check other tables. After breakfast came work assignments. Captain Morrison explained through the translator that all labor was voluntary under Geneva rules, but those who worked would earn their 80 cents daily. The jobs were mundane: laundry detail, garden work, kitchen help, cleaning barracks. Nothing backbreaking. Nothing designed to humiliate. Greta chose garden detail because it meant being outside, meant dirt under her fingernails, meant something to focus on, besides the noise in her head. The camp garden stretched behind the mess hall, a large plot with rows of tomatoes, beans, squash, and herbs. An American private named Chen supervised, showing them which weeds to pull and which plants to water. He worked alongside them, his hands as dirty as theirs, treating the vegetables with a care that suggested he actually wanted them to thrive. Greta fell into the rhythm of it. The physical labor, a mercy. Pull weeds, water roots, check for insects. Simple problems with simple solutions. At midday, they broke for lunch. Sandwiches and lemonade brought out on trays. Real lemonade, tart and sweet at once. Greta drank half of hers before remembering she didn't deserve it. then forced herself to finish because wasting food felt like an even worse sin. The afternoon passed in similar fashion. More weeding, more watering. The sun beat down hot and clean. Nothing like the smoke-choked skies she remembered from the last months of war. Her back ached pleasantly by the time the evening bell rang. Honest work ache, not the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to save men who were already gone. Dinner was stew with actual meat in it, bread that was only 1 day old, and canned peaches for dessert. Greta ate mechanically, fuel for a body that kept insisting on survival, despite her best efforts to feel nothing. Around her in the mess hall, the dynamics were already shifting. Some women were softening, laughing tentatively at shared jokes, asking the guards hesitant questions in broken English. Others were hardening, their faces set in stone, refusing to acknowledge kindness as anything but strategy. That night in the barracks, the whispers started. Liesel's bunk creaked as she leaned over the edge to talk to Greta. "They're really following the rules," she whispered in German. "The Geneva Convention. They're actually doing it." Greta stared at the ceiling, at shadows that refused to hold any answers. "This is a game," she said flatly. "They want us compliant. Soft. Then they'll do whatever they planned all along." "But what if they don't?" Liesel pressed. "What if this is just what it looks like?" Greta had no answer for that. She rolled onto her side, facing the wall, and closed her eyes against questions she couldn't afford to ask. Outside, that smoke smell drifted past again, richer tonight, layered with something that made her stomach twist with hunger she refused to acknowledge. "Low and slow," someone had said once, about smoking meat. You couldn't rush it. You had to let time and heat work their magic. She fell asleep thinking about smoke and patience, about things that broke down slowly until they became something entirely different. And she wondered, in the last hazy moment before sleep claimed her, whether she was the meat or the fire, and whether there was any difference when everything burned. 6 weeks became a routine that Greta both craved and resented. Morning bell at 6:30. Roll call. Breakfast that still felt like an accusation. Then the garden, where at least the work made sense. Tomatoes needed staking. Bean plants needed trellising. Weeds didn't care about war or guilt. They just grew, persistent and thoughtless. And pulling them gave her hands something to do while her mind spun in circles it couldn't escape. The garden became her refuge. Private Chen had been transferred to another duty, replaced by a rotating schedule of supervision that mostly meant the POWs worked alone. Greta learned the rhythm of the Kansas growing season, so different from the small kitchen gardens she'd tended as a girl in Hamburg. Here, everything grew fast and wild under a sun that felt twice as hot. The soil was darker, richer. Things thrived if you gave them half a chance. Letters trickled in from Germany through Red Cross channels, each one a fresh wound. Hamburg was rubble and occupation zones. Berlin was divided, starving, bitter. Her cousin wrote from Frankfurt that rations were tighter now than during the war, that former soldiers were being held in work camps, that everyone was angry at everyone and nobody knew how to stop being angry. Another letter, from a former neighbor, mentioned that Greta's younger sister Elsa had been seen working on a farm in the British zone, thin but alive. That one Greta read 3 times, her hands shaking with something that might have been hope if she'd let it be. She stopped writing back. What could she possibly say? "I'm in Kansas eating eggs and bacon while you're starving? They treat us with respect that I don't deserve." Every word felt like betrayal, so she wrote nothing at all and let the silence speak for her. It was late July when Liesel burned her hand. They were helping in the kitchen, voluntary work that earned the same 80 cents a day, and Liesel reached for a pot handle without checking if it was hot. The scream brought Greta running from where she'd been scrubbing dishes. Liesel stood at the stove, her right palm already blistering, tears streaming down her face. Greta's training kicked in before thought could interfere. She grabbed Liesel's wrist, shoved her hand under the cold water tap, and held it there while assessing the damage. Second-degree burn, maybe 3 inches across. Painful, but not dangerous if treated properly. She barked orders in German, someone get the first aid kit, someone else clear that counter, and within minutes had Liesel sitting down while she cleaned and dressed the wound with supplies from the camp's medical station. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of 3 years in field hospitals. Clean the burn. Apply sulfa powder to prevent infection. Wrap with sterile gauze, firm but not tight. Check circulation in the fingers. All of it automatic. A language her body spoke more fluently than words. She'd done this hundreds of times under shell fire and in bombed-out aid stations. Here, in a clean Kansas kitchen with proper supplies, it felt almost absurdly easy. When she finished, she looked up to find Sergeant Caldwell watching from near the pantry door. He'd been quiet during the whole ordeal, just observing. Now he stepped forward, his eyes moving from the bandaged hand to Greta's face with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You were a nurse," he said. Not a question, but a statement delivered in that slow Texas drawl. A real one. Greta nodded stiffly. "Wehrmacht Auxiliary," she said in careful English, the words bitter in her mouth. 3 years. Field hospitals. He didn't flinch at the Wehrmacht part. Didn't recoil or spit or show any of the disgust she'd been bracing for. He just looked at her handiwork, at the neat bandage and Liesel's calming tears, and said something that pierced straight through her defenses. "War makes nurses out of everyone." His voice was tired, matter of fact. "You're good at it." 4 words. You're good at it. Not you were useful to your side or you served the enemy well. Just acknowledgement of skill, of craft, of the thing she'd spent years learning how to do. For a moment, just a breath, just a heartbeat, Greta felt something crack in the wall she'd built around herself. Someone had seen her work, not her flag, had recognized competence instead of nationality. She looked away quickly, focusing on repacking the first aid kit, but her hands trembled slightly as she did. Liesel thanked her in German, effusive and grateful, but Greta barely heard. That crack in her armor terrified her more than any cruelty could have. The announcement came 2 days later. Captain Morrison assembled them after dinner, standing on his platform with his clipboard and his carefully pressed uniform. Through the translator, he explained that the 4th of July, America's Independence Day, was coming up. There would be a camp-wide celebration, a barbecue, music, and games. All POWs were invited to attend. Attendance was voluntary, he stressed. Nobody would be punished for staying in the barracks, but those who came would receive the same holiday rations as American soldiers, as required by Geneva Convention protocols. The barracks erupted in debate the moment they were dismissed. Half the women saw it as propaganda, a photo opportunity to show the world how well America treated its prisoners. The other half saw it as exactly what Morrison had said, a holiday, nothing more or less. Greta listened to them argue, her jaw tight. It was obviously a trick, obviously manipulation. Nobody threw parties for their enemies unless they wanted something. Liesel, her hands still bandaged but healing well, climbed into her bunk that night and leaned over the edge to look at Greta. "Are you going to go?" she asked quietly. "No," Greta said flatly. "It's theater, humiliation disguised as generosity." "What if it's not?" Liesel pressed, her voice small but persistent. "What if they just mean it? What if they really are following the rules?" Greta had no answer. She rolled over, facing the wall, and tried to sleep. But that smoke smell came again that evening, heavier than usual, richer and more complex. Mesquite and oak, someone had said once, though Greta didn't know enough about American woods to tell the difference. Whatever it was, it had been smoking for hours, low and slow, patient as grief. For the first time since arriving at Camp Concordia, Greta realized she was hungry, not just physically, though her stomach did twist with want, but hungry for something she couldn't name. Hungry for an answer to questions she'd been refusing to ask. Hungry to understand how the people who'd bombed her cities could smoke meat with such care that the smell alone made her mouth water. She lay awake long into the night, listening to the other women breathe in sleep, and wondered what it would cost her to walk into that celebration, what it would mean to accept food from hands that had dropped bombs, whether there was any difference between surrender and survival, and whether she had any right to either one. July 4th, 1946 dawned clear and hot, the kind of Kansas summer day where heat shimmered off the ground by 9 in the morning. Greta had told herself she wouldn't go, had spent the previous 3 days constructing every rational argument for why attending was wrong, was weak, was collaboration with the very people who'd destroyed everything she'd known. She would stay in the barracks, read the letters she couldn't bring herself to answer, tend the silence that had become her only honest companion. But Liesel had other plans. She appeared at Greta's bunk an hour before the celebration was scheduled to start, her burned hand healing nicely, her face set with a determination that looked out of place on someone barely 19. "You're coming," she said in German, not asking. "You don't have to eat anything. You don't have to smile or talk or pretend. But you're coming with me because I'm scared to go alone, and you're the only person here I trust." It was the last part that broke Greta's resolve. Not the pleading, but the simple admission of fear. She'd spent 3 years watching boys bleed out on operating tables, their last words calls for mothers who'd never hear them. She knew what real fear looked like, and she knew what it cost to face it without someone steady nearby. So she went. Told herself it was reconnaissance, observation, an anthropological study of the enemy at leisure. Told herself anything except the truth, that she was hungry for answers and terrified of what those answers might be. The compound had been transformed. American soldiers had strung lights between barracks, even though it was daylight, as if planning for the celebration to last into evening. Long tables covered in checked cloth stood in rows near the mess hall. A phonograph sat on a platform, already playing music that sounded nothing like the martial marches Greta associated with military camps. This was something looser, jazzier, with a trumpet, that seemed to laugh at its own freedom. Pitchers of what looked like sweet tea sweated in the heat, ice cubes floating impossibly in the amber liquid. Ice. In July. As if abundance was just assumed. POWs gathered in hesitant clusters, some curious, others defiant. American soldiers moved among them, not guarding but mixing, some attempting conversation in broken German, others just smiling and gesturing toward the tables. The whole thing felt surreal, like a play being performed by actors who'd forgotten they were supposed to be enemies. Then Sergeant Caldwell and his kitchen crew emerged from the mess hall, and the smell that had been haunting Greta for weeks hit full force. They carried huge platters, brisket sliced thick, ribs glazed and glistening, pulled pork piled high. Behind them came more dishes, corn on the cob dripping with butter, coleslaw, beans simmered with molasses, cornbread cut into golden squares. It wasn't rations. It wasn't survival food portioned out by weight and regulation. It was abundance. It was pride. It was food cooked with such care that the cooking itself became a statement. Caldwell supervised the arrangement of dishes with the same precision Greta had seen surgeons use, laying out instruments. Everything had its place. Everything mattered. When he stepped back to survey the spread, his expression was one of quiet satisfaction, like a man who'd just finished building something that would last. The American soldiers formed a serving line, but didn't serve themselves first. They gestured for the POWs to go ahead, to take plates, to help themselves. No separate line, no lesser portions, no visible difference between captor and captive in that moment. A young soldier with red hair and freckles told Liesel in halting German that his grandmother had come from Bavaria, that maybe that made them almost cousins. Liesel laughed, a sound so unexpected it made Greta's chest ache. Greta took a plate because Liesel pressed it into her hands and refused to move forward without her. She moved through the line in a daze, letting food be spooned onto her plate by American hands that didn't shake with hatred or grudge. Brisket, ribs, a scoop of coleslaw, cornbread that was still warm. By the time she reached the end of the table, her plate was heavy with food she couldn't imagine eating. They found seats at one of the long tables. Around them, the impossible was happening. German women and American soldiers sharing benches, passing pitchers of tea, attempting conversation across language barriers with lots of hand gestures and laughter when words failed. It looked like a church picnic. It looked like family reunion. It looked like anything except what it actually was. Greta stared at her plate. The brisket had a dark crust of pepper and salt, the meat beneath pink from smoke. She could see where it had been sliced against the grain, the way her mother had taught her to slice meat when there was meat to be had. She picked up her fork, put it down, picked it up again. Liesel was already eating, her eyes closed in something close to bliss. "Just try it," she whispered. "Please, just one bite." Greta cut a piece of brisket, lifted it to her mouth. The smell alone made her dizzy. She bit down, and the meat fell apart on her tongue. Smoke, and salt and pepper, and something deeper. Something that tasted like time, and patience and care. Fat rendered to nothing, collagen broken down into silk. 14 hours, someone had said. 14 hours of tending fire, and watching temperature and caring whether this turned out right. She took another bite, then another. Her vision blurred. Her throat closed up, but she kept chewing, kept swallowing, kept reaching for more, even as tears started streaming down her face. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was grief hitting her like a train because this food was better than anything she'd eaten in 5 years, and her mother had died eating potato peel soup, and the universe was so fundamentally broken that both those things could be true at once. Liesel reached for her, but Greta pulled away, standing abruptly. Her chair scraped loud against dirt. People looked. She didn't care. She couldn't stop crying and she couldn't stop eating, and both things were happening simultaneously, her body betraying every promise she'd made to stay hard, to stay angry, to never forgive. The propaganda had said Americans were barbarians, monsters who'd burned cities and killed civilians and deserved nothing but hatred. But barbarians didn't smoke meat for 14 hours for prisoners they were supposed to despise. Monsters didn't serve food with the kind of care that made cooking itself an act of respect. Greta fled. Plate still in her hands, half-eaten, she stumbled away from the tables toward the nearest building. Her breath came in gasps. The cornbread felt like lead in her stomach. The brisket tasted like accusation. How do you reconcile being fed like a guest when your mother starved? How do you accept mercy from the people who dropped the bombs that started the whole cascade of ruin? She made it to the latrine building before collapsing against its wall, sliding down to sit on hard ground. Her plate tipped, spilling food into the dirt. She sobbed into her hands, great wrenching sounds she couldn't control, couldn't stop, couldn't even understand fully. Footsteps approached, stopped a few feet away. She looked up through blurred vision to see Sergeant Caldwell standing there, not crowding her, just present. His face was sad but not surprised, like he'd seen this before, like he knew exactly what was breaking inside her. The words came out in broken English, rage and grief tangled so tight she couldn't separate them. "Why?" she demanded, her voice raw. "Why are you kind? We killed your brother, your people. Why do you feed us like this?" She didn't know how she knew about his brother. Maybe she'd overheard kitchen gossip, the way hospital staff always talked. Maybe she'd seen the way he touched the dog tags he kept in his pocket when he thought nobody was watching. Or maybe grief just recognized grief across every border and language. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the compound where the celebration continued without them. Music drifted on the hot air. Laughter. The clink of forks on plates. Finally, he lowered himself to sit on the ground a few feet away, not close enough to crowd her, but near enough that she could hear him over the noise in her own head. "Yeah," he said slowly, his drawl thick with something that might have been exhaustion. "My baby brother, Tommy, Omaha Beach. He didn't even make it off the sand." Greta's throat closed. She'd tended enough American wounded to know what Omaha Beach meant, what those boys had walked into, the ocean turning red. "He was 22, Caldwell continued, still not looking at her. "Wrote me every week, always asking about the restaurant we were going to open together when he got home. Always noticing things, the way French kids played marbles, how the old ladies wore their scarves, what the churches looked like. He saw people everywhere, not enemies, just people." His hand moved to his pocket, touched something there. "Tommy asked me in his last letter if I thought German soldiers had families waiting for them too, if their mothers worried the same way ours did." I got that letter 3 weeks after the telegram saying he was dead. Greta wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small, waiting for the turn. For the but that justified hatred, that made cruelty reasonable. It didn't come. "So I could let that make me cruel," Caldwell said quietly. "Could make every German I meet pay for what happened to him. Could serve you garbage and call it justice." His voice hardened slightly. "And some days I want to. Some days I wake up and the anger's so big I don't know what to do with it." He finally looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers, with a directness that felt almost painful. "But if I do that, if I let Tommy's death turn me into something mean and small, then he died for nothing. He went over there believing America stood for something better, that we could win without becoming what we fought against." The tears kept coming, but Greta had stopped trying to hide them. She stared at this man who had every reason to hate her, who fed her enemy instead. "So I smoke brisket," Caldwell said, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "I follow the rules. I treat y'all like the convention says I should, like human beings who just had the bad luck to be on the wrong side. And I remember that my brother wanted a world worth coming home to, even if he never got to see it." The silence between them stretched long. In the distance, someone had started a game that involved throwing horseshoes at stakes, the metal clanging cheerfully. The sun beat down. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, sweet and patient. "I was healing Americans," Greta whispered, "when my mother starved. January, Hamburg. I was in your field hospital, warm and fed, and she was eating soup made from potato peels. She died and I lived because I was useful to the enemy." Caldwell absorbed this without flinching. "That wasn't your choice to make," he said finally. "You didn't kill her. The war killed her. The whole damn machine killed her. You were just trying to survive." "But I did survive," Greta said, and the words tasted like ash. "I'm here eating brisket that's better than anything I've had in 5 years, and she's in a mass grave in Hamburg. How is that fair? How do I deserve this?" "You don't," Caldwell said bluntly, and the honesty of it shocked her into looking at him. "None of us deserve what we get. Tommy didn't deserve Omaha Beach. Your mother didn't deserve to starve. You don't deserve to carry guilt that belongs to men in power rooms who sent all of us into this mess. But here we are anyway. The question isn't whether you deserve mercy. The question is what you're going to do with it, now that you've got it." Greta's breath hitched. She looked down at her hands, at the dirt under her nails from the garden, at the calluses from years of gripping surgical instruments and bandages. Hands that had saved lives on both sides. Hands that hadn't saved the one life that mattered most. "My sister's alive," she said quietly. surprised to hear herself speaking. British Zone. Working a farm. I got a letter 3 weeks ago, Caldwell nodded. That's something then. Something to build on, is it? Greta asked. Not really a question. Can you build anything on foundations this broken? Tommy thought so, Caldwell said. He believed people could do better after seeing the worst. I'm trying to believe that too. Some days are easier than others. He stood slowly, his knees cracking with the movement. I'm gonna head back. You take your time. Nobody's gonna bother you out here. But when you're ready, there's still food, and it's yours, whether you think you deserve it or not. He walked away, leaving her sitting against the latrine wall with her spilled plate and her streaming tears. Greta sat there for a long time, watching the celebration from a distance, watching people who should have been enemies sharing food and tentative laughter. The cognitive dissonance was so complete, it felt like her brain might crack trying to hold both truths at once. That these people had destroyed her country, and that they were feeding her with genuine care. That she was the enemy, and that she was being treated with dignity anyway. Eventually, Liesl found her. Sat down beside her without speaking, just present. The younger woman's burned hand was healing well. Pink, new skin showing at the edges of the bandage Greta had wrapped. Evidence that some things could be fixed with time and proper care. I think, Greta said finally, her voice hoarse from crying, I need to learn how to do that. The smoking, the brisket. Liesl looked at her, confused. Why? Because when I go home, Greta said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it. I want to cook something that doesn't taste like war. Something that takes time and patience. Something that says there's still beauty possible. Liesl took her hand, squeezed gently. That sounds like a good reason. They sat together as the celebration continued, as the sun tracked across the Kansas sky, as the smoke from Caldwell's cookers finally died down to embers. And Greta let herself imagine, just for a moment, a future where she might stand in front of a smoker of her own, tending meat with care, cooking for her sister, building something new from the ashes of everything that burned.